Hey guys, here we are in week 29, and we are getting ready to start our series on the end times prophecy in the Old Testament for our No study. Congratulations, you have completed going through the Old Testament starting way back in August, and you've made it, and now you get to kind of sit back. You don't have as much reading to do, and you can just listen to 2 weeks where we're going to talk about end times in the Old Testament. Now, what are our goals going to be here? Our goals are going to be a Berean. The Bereans were people in the New Testament who searched the scriptures to see if these things were true, and that's what we want to do. We do not want to be a doctrinal drone. And what do I mean by that? We want to be a biblicist. We want to focus and study on what the Bible says and what the Bible teaches, and not be married or just in love with a certain doctrine to the point we're going to fight for it no matter what, no matter how much evidence there is against it. And we want the truth, not our own pet theory, to be right. And we want to keep an open mind. Now, we're going to be talking about the Old Testament and how that fits in with all the prophecies in the end time. Tonight, we're going to be especially focusing on a lot of Daniel that we didn't cover when we covered Daniel. We're going to be in chapters 2, 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12, because we did not cover them at all, and these are highly related and integrated to Revelation and end times prophecy. And I'm going to present to you an alternative to the Roman theory as well as the Roman theory. And what I want to make clear is this is not my pet theory. I'm not saying that this theory is right and this is the correct one. I'm not saying that this is correct and this is the right one. What I'm going to say is there are problems with the Roman theory, some big problems, and this theory seems to solve all of them. Now, I don't know that anybody knows the truth about this, guys, so I don't think we should be dogmatic, but I think we need to keep an open mind, and when the Bible speaks strongly, we need to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to at least consider this, at least keep this in the game. And I can tell you in recent years, there have been people like John MacArthur, a very famous and well-respected Bible teacher, who has looked at this and analyzed it, and you can go on the web and see for yourself. He's preaching on it because he thinks that it is right. Now, what my goal is to just expose this to you and show it to you and teach some on the Old Testament. So let's get going. So some important questions. What nations does the Lord fight and destroy in the day of the Lord prophecies that are clearly end times related? So we need to say, what are those nations? Do these people want to destroy Israel even today? Do these nations currently behead people like it clearly is happening in Revelation? That'll be an important question to answer, won't it? Shouldn't these nations at least be included in any end times theory? So if we're going to see a group of nations that are all over the Old Testament, how could we leave them out, right? Why would they ever be excluded unless someone is in that pet theory camp where they're only going to teach things that support their pet theory, and we do not want to be those kind of Bible teachers. And then we need to see, how do these prophecies that we're going to look at, because that's where we're going to start, mesh with Daniel? Do they mesh? Do they contradict? If it's the truth, everything should fit like a glove. So here we go. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with just a quick review of end times prophetic passages that deal with the day of the Lord. And I'm not going to read all these to you because we've been through them before, but I'm going to point out to you the major highlights in each one. So in Isaiah 25, there is a prophecy which clearly relates to the end times, because what you can see here is that up here in the right, he will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all the faces, right? So you can see that that's there on the upper right there in the yellow. And then over there, in verse 10, you can see that Moab will be trampled down. And if you read the whole thing, it's clear it's talking about the end of the age. And the Lord is fighting, in this case, against Moab. And he's not fighting against, some European nation. If we look at Obadiah 10, 8 through 10 and 15 and 20, we will see that the Lord is fighting against Edom, that it talks about the day of the Lord, and that he's talking about dispossessing the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. Again, these are nations which are around Jerusalem. In Ezekiel 25, we can see a proclamation against Edom and against Philistia, where the Philistines were. And he's mentioning here Teman and Dedan, which can go all the way down into parts of Arabia. And then the Philistines will be kind of the modern day area of where the Palestinians are. Again, these are day of the Lord, end times type prophecies in the Old Testament, and we've covered them. In Ezekiel 30, you can see here we have in verse 3, for the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be of clouds, the time of the Gentiles. The sword shall come upon Egypt, and great anguish shall be in Ethiopia when the slain fall in Egypt, and they take away her wealth, and her foundations are broken. Ethiopia, Libya, Turkey, and all the mingled people, Arabia, and the men of the lands who are allied shall fall with them by the sword. And again, if you look at this whole prophecy in context here, it is again an end times prophecy of the Lord fighting against these nations, and they're Ethiopia, Egypt, Arabia, Libya, and Turkey. And this just goes on and on. We have Zephaniah 2 and verses 3 to 5. We have Ashkelon and Ashdod. That's the area of the Philistines. We have Moab and Ammon over here on the right in verses 8 through 9. Isaiah 63 is very interesting. Look what it says. Who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? Again, that would be the area down where Petra is, south of Israel. The one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength, I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red and your garments like one who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone. From the peoples no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger, and I trampled them in my fury. Their sprinkled blood is upon my garments, and I have stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. A clear end times prophecy there. And this is confirmed even in Revelation. I won't read it to you, but look, I have it highlighted there for you in yellow. See the clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and he himself treads the winepress. The exact same wording. So Revelation is really referring to Isaiah 63. Here in Zephaniah, we have Assyria and Nineveh mentioned. That's Zephaniah 2, 12 to 13. The Ethiopians are also mentioned here. And you can see those nations there. Those are the nations that surround Israel. And if we put it all together, and I have it in a table here for you, and again, you can go back and look them, and there's more. This is not even complete, right? They are all today Muslim nations, every single one of them. These are the nations which surround Israel, which were a problem to them their entire life in the Old and New Testament. These were the ones who were always a problem for them, and they are still problems for them today, and they still surround them today, and every single one of them is a Muslim nation. If we look on a map here, on the left, we have those nations that are mentioned in the Old Testament prophecy, Day of the Lord, and where they are located. Those are just all the nations that we saw. We have Arabia and Egypt. We have Babylon, Assyria, areas up in Turkey. We have Philistia and Damascus and Sidon and Tyre. And then if you look over on the right, these would be the modern nations of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, the Arabian area of the desert, or Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And again, every single one of them are Muslim nations, right? So now let's look at a review of Satan and the Antichrist. A few prophecies that relate to them. And this one we looked at before, Isaiah 14, if you remember, the king of Babylon, and it's very famous where he says, I will ascend and I will exalt and I will sit and I will. That's kind of Satan exalting himself as God. And what's interesting here is that when you read in Isaiah 14, the king of Babylon is the one who's portrayed as Satan. If you start up at the beginning, it starts off talking about the king of Babylon, and then in the middle, right here in verse 12, it switches and starts talking about Lucifer. But again, in the context, Babylon, the king of Babylon, and Satan are linked together. And if you keep reading down, this continues with the future destruction of Revelation Babylon in Isaiah 14. And if we go to Isaiah 14, it talks about the Assyrian. Look what it says, that I will break the Assyrian in my land. In verse 26, this is the purpose that is purposed against the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. So here what we see, if we look at Isaiah in these two verses that I've shown you, is that both Satan, pictured as Babylon, and the Antichrist, pictured as Assyria, are equated with current-day Muslim nations that will be destroyed in the final day of the Lord. And in Isaiah 9, there are more verses talking here about the Assyrian. We covered some of these. What we have on the left here is a prophecy which is actually quoted by Matthew. You can see it there in blue. By the way of the sea beyond the Jordan and Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. That's quoted in Matthew, so we know it's talking about Jesus. And then what you have over here in the right, he talks about the Messiah fighting and breaking the burden, as in the day of Midian, when Midian and Gideon delivered them from the enemies that were surrounding Israel at that time. And then it goes on there in verses 6 through 7 to have some more famous verses, which are talking about the coming of Jesus. So what we learn here is that the Messiah will deliver Israel from the Assyrian, like the defeat of Midian by Gideon in Judges 8. And if we look at Micah 5, another famous verse here, look in verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth, and the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. And it goes on and on there. But what's interesting is Matthew quotes this, and this is talking about, Jesus's first coming. And then this, in verse 3, deals with the interim between the first and the second coming. And the second coming is there in green. And what's interesting is if you read up, look what happens here on the right, starting in verse 5. And this one shall be peace, talking about exactly who we saw there on the left, Jesus. He's the one who's going to be the ruler and deliverer and all that. This one shall be peace when the Assyrian comes into our land. Thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land. Again, we have Jesus fighting the Antichrist in an end times type prophecy, clearly defined by the New Testament, and it's again showing him to be an Assyrian. So in summary, the nations that the Lord fights against in the end times day of the Lord are all Muslim nations, every single one of them. And none are European. Satan and Antichrist are both matched to Muslim nations. And all the nations and both its two main leaders are portrayed as coming from modern day Muslim areas in the Old Testament. So you have to ask yourself, no, wait a minute, if this whole Roman thing, which I've been taught, where the end times is a revived Roman Empire, and there's a European leader, and the European Union forms these 10 nations which are going to come against them. What about these nations that are clearly in the Bible? I mean, nothing's mentioned of Europe, and everything is mentioned about these nations around them. You have to at least explain or include them. You can't exclude them when it's so overwhelmingly talked about here. So let's keep going. Now, that's just the backdrop. We have prophets throughout the Old Testament in a unified voice speaking about the day of the Lord, right? We have prophets from the entire Old Testament. Almost every single prophet who speaks about the day of the Lord talks about nations that the Lord will fight in the end, and they're all Muslim nations. So that's a problem for any Roman theory. And now what we want to do is look at how does this match fit with Daniel, right? We want to see because Daniel is key, and we haven't even studied Daniel yet, so let's do that. So we're going to go here with Daniel. We're going to be in chapters 2, 7, 8, 11, and 12. We're going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar's statue dream and Daniel's vision of the beasts. Now, the four pillars of the Roman end times theory, this is how this theory got started. Now, look, guys, this is the theory that I was taught, and I believed it, and I'm not saying I don't believe it anymore. I'm saying that this theory has made me question it, and I'm keeping an open mind. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so the first reason that this was chosen, the Roman theory, was because of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the giant statue, and I'll show you why. The second reason was Daniel's vision of the four beasts. The third reason was a verse in Daniel 9 that talks about the people of the prince to come. And the fourth reason is a verse from Revelation 17 that talks about the city on 7 hills, and people have identified that as Rome. This is the reason why Rome was chosen. It is these four facts, and we're going to look at them in detail, each one. Here we go. So here we are in Daniel, and remember, the chronological orders of the chapters is that over here on the left, we see the statue in chapter 2. We're going to be looking there. And then the prophecies of 7 and 8 were much further along in his career. So just for a little context there, those are the ones we're going to mainly be focusing on right now. And what we see is in chapters 2, 7, and 8 that Daniel has visions. In chapter 2, he has a vision of this statue, a dream which Daniel interprets. And then in chapter 7 and 8, these are visions that are given to Daniel directly. And Daniel sees 4 beasts in chapter 7 and 2 in chapter 8. And the interpretation is given to us for all of them. And what we learn is that they all fit together. Each of the 4 beasts fits with the 4 different parts of the statue, and I have them lined up, and I'll show you that. And then the goat and the ram and the goat there fit with the bear and the leopard. So they all match up. They're all complementary. They're all meant to give you a little bit more information. So let's look at this. So we have here in chapter 2, the vision of the statue, and then chapter 7, the 4 beasts, which are directly correlate to the 4 different portions of the statue, give us more information about chapter 2. And then over here on the right in chapter 8, we have the ram and the goat, and they are given us more information by chapters 11 and 12. So chapter 7 expands on chapter 2, and chapters 11 and 2 expand upon 8, and they all fit together. So now chapter 2 is really the key one, because if you get this wrong, all the others are wrong. So let's read this. We're going to read the whole dream and its interpretation here, starting with Daniel's interpretation because he describes it, and then we'll start there. So starting in Daniel chapter 2, verse 31, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So here we see this statue, and it has basically 4 different main sections with different precious metals. And then there's the stone that comes up and basically destroys them all, and the stone becomes a great mountain. And we know in Scripture that mountain refers to kingdom, and so this kingdom is going to fill the whole earth. And that's important, that mountain is kingdom. So keep that in mind. And now Daniel goes on to give the interpretation. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. So Daniel tells us who the head of gold is, which will be the kingdom of Babylon. And other chapters, just so you know, will tell us which ones the others are. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. It shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So here is a picture of the statue here, and this is the classical modern interpretation. And if we look at the head of gold, that is Babylon, and Daniel tells us that. And then we have a area of silver around the chest and arms. That's Medo-Persia. And then after that, we have the waist area of bronze, which was Greece. And then we have the iron legs, which is Rome. And then the iron and clay would be a revived Roman confederacy. And we can see here just to the right of those in chapter 7, the four beasts, and I'll show you this again, that the lion that Daniel sees is Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, and the bear is Medo-Persia, and the leopard is Greece, and then there's this beast. And then in Daniel 8, we have the ram and the goat, and they correspond to Medo-Persia and Greece. And the scripture tells us specifically which ones these animals are, and I'll show you that. So just to review, here's the statue. We have number 1, the head of gold. Number 2, the body of silver. Number 3, the area of bronze around the belly waist area. And then we have the area of iron legs. And then we have kind of the related to that, which is contiguous with the feet, an area of iron and clay mixed together in the feet. And then there's the stone, which is going to come and crush them all. And in Daniel 2, we saw that we learned that the head of gold is Babylon. And we learned that the area of the silver thorax is Medo-Persia in Daniel 8:20. And Greece is the area of the bronze area. And this is the direct correlation from Daniel 7, that the lion fits with the head of gold. The bear is Medo-Persia. The leopard with the heads and the wings is Greece, the 4 heads and the wings. And then there's this beast. And in Daniel 8, we have the ram and the goat, and they directly correspond to Medo-Persia and Greece. So they all line up, they all fit together. But the fourth kingdom, this kingdom here that is never named, although again in modern times it's always named as Rome. And then the last part of that, the iron and the clay, is then the revived Roman Empire. Okay? Now, let's move on. So this bottom portion here, we are not told. Everything else above the line, we are told and we do know for certain. So it's just this last kingdom that is not named. So if we look at 2, 7, and 8, this is what we just reviewed with you. Again, Babylon being the head of gold, Medo-Persia and Greece, the silver and the bronze, and then the iron is not named. Now, this is very important. Look at what Daniel said in verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. So whatever that kingdom is, it has to crush all the others. And in Daniel 7, right, it says basically the same thing. The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces, right? So this fourth beast has to break in pieces and crush at least those three empires, doesn't it? I mean, that's exactly what the prophecy says. Now, if we look at these major beast empires through time, we have here on the left the Babylonian Empire. That's their extent of what they controlled. And then we have the bear, which is Medo-Persia. That was the extent of their empire. And then we have Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. And you can see that they slowly increased in spread from the time of Babylon to the time of Alexander the Great, right? So this is the area, right? If you're going to encompass all these three maps together, this area here circled in red would have to be destroyed by this fourth kingdom. But the problem is when you look at the Roman Empire, it leaves 2/3 of that area out. If the Roman Empire comes in and when it takes over, it doesn't even deal with most of the central area of these nations that Daniel said that they would destroy. So there's a major problem there. But look at this. If you look at the Islamic Caliphate and what they conquered, it exactly fits. In fact, it's even just a tad a little bit more. Okay? So just something to think about there. There's a zoomed in view. So the destruction of the fourth empire, right? That fourth empire is supposed to eliminate all the others. But the Roman Empire didn't even get to Babylon, Iran, or Iraq, or into Arabia at all, whereas the Caliphate did. So the Caliphate actually matches much better that portion of the prophecy. And the other thing that it said, did Rome crush, trample, and destroy like Daniel said it did? Rome, no, it did not. Rome was a nation-building empire. It did not replace the local religion, but imposed rules and tariffs like in the time of Israel under Roman authority. They were tolerant. Rome was constructive, building roads and infrastructure. The Islamic Caliphate, however, crushed and erased the nations and cultures that it conquered. It forced them into their religion. It forced conversion to Islam or death. And Muslims to this day deny Israel any right to the land and even deny their historical temple built there. Now, look what it says here in Daniel 2:34-35, which we just read. This is talking about now the stone, which we know is Jesus in the end times. And as you look, the stone was cut, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. So this Messiah, Jesus, when he comes, he has to wipe out all those empires. Right? Now, Messiah destroys the final kingdom of Antichrist, and by virtue, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, all at the same time, right? That's what it says, that the stone is going to destroy the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all broken in pieces and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors at one time, right? But if the Roman Empire were fully revived and destroyed, then 2/3 of these empires would be untouched while the Islamic Caliphate fits perfectly. And remember that this dream, the context of the dream, is a Middle Eastern, not Western society. The prophecy was given in Babylon, which is Iraq, to a Babylonian king about kingdoms that would succeed his. That's the context of Daniel 2. It's a Middle Eastern prophecy. It's not a Western prophecy. And it was given to a Babylonian king about kingdoms that would succeed his in Babylon, which would be modern-day Iraq. And the Roman Empire was mainly Western and did not align itself to the context of the dream. And let me show you that again. It's the same problem that we just saw. If this stone is going to come and take all the others out, if we have the revived Roman Empire here down at the bottom with the red circle, and everything shaded in orange is what they controlled, then when the stone comes and wipes them out, he doesn't touch 2/3 of those empires, does he? It doesn't fulfill the prophecy of Daniel 2 at all. And it's actually kind of blatant. But if the final empire were to be the Islamic Caliphate revived, right? If that were true, and the stone comes and conquers them all, he conquers Medo-Persia, Babylon, and Greece, doesn't he? So that actually fits, again, perfectly. And again, that's just a blown up view. They're showing the problem with the Roman Empire and how the Islamic Caliphate fits perfectly. So that we have three major problems so far with Daniel 2. One, Rome is the fourth kingdom, does not crush the nations mentioned in the prophecy. Remember, 2/3 were left out. Rome was not a crushing and destroying nation, but a building one. That doesn't fit. And thirdly, when Jesus returns, he must destroy all the nations from the statue at once, and the Roman theory leaves 2/3 of them out also. So it just doesn't work. Now let's keep going. There's more here. Look what it says again in Daniel 2, still talking with the statue, talking about the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, right? They were mixed. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the Muslim nation as a whole, Sunnis make up 86% of all, and Shiites 14% of all. There is a lot of intra-Islamic violence. They fight, they'll even kill each other. So they are not completely cohesive. And this has been going on since the early days of when after Muhammad died. Now they have minor religious differences, and they're stable, but they are ethnically and religiously divided. And this has been their condition for 1,300 years. So even this seems to fit well with whatever this mixture means. And let me show you something else even more interesting. Look what it says, and just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. So it's saying the people aren't going to be completely united. Now the word mixed there, or mixture in Aramaic here, is Arab. Literally Arab. And that's the reason that the descendants of Ishmael and Esau are called Arabs today, because they even today, because they intermarried a lot. They were mixed, right? And basically what that verse literally says is they will be Arab. Isn't that interesting? Now, what we need to understand now is that this fourth beast there, at the bottom, which is labeled as Rome, because that's the classic theory there, right? On the left, we have the statue of Daniel. In the middle, we have the four beasts from Daniel's vision of chapter 7. We have the lion, the bear, and the four-headed leopard, which we know are Babylon, Medo, Persia, and Greece. And then we have this beast, which isn't named. We have it as Rome there, and it has 10 horns, and we'll get into that. But what we need to understand then is that it's this beast here from Daniel 7 that is, and mentioned also in elsewhere in Daniel, but it is that beast that is then elaborated on and talked about in detail in different ways in Revelation 12, 13, and 17, because we're going to see a beast with 10 horns and with 7 heads and this kind of thing. And they all three are talking about the same empire, just from different perspectives, and they all relate directly back to Daniel. So Daniel's fourth beast is amplified in Revelation in chapters 12, 13, and 17. Now, let's read about this. This is the beast in Revelation. And remember that a beast has been made clear is an empire. Daniel tells us that. So when we hear the word beast, we know that it's an empire. Revelation 13, verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. Now, do you see already the similarity there? Right? We have the leopard, the bear, and the lion, and we have the 10 horns, all of which are mentioned in Daniel. Right? So there's Daniel's 4 beasts from Daniel 7, and we see that this final beast in Revelation is a compilation of all of the beasts mentioned by Daniel. So the final beast in Revelation in the end times is a compilation of all of them. Right? Babylon, Medo, Persia, and Greece, they're all kind of conglomerated there together. Again, all Middle Eastern, all Muslim, right? And making up the nations of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Syria, and the Balkans. And then we have the woman rides the beast in chapter 17. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Remember, a kingdom, or a a kingdom which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So you can see how they're similar there. They are kingdoms that are being sat on, and that's the final empire. They are empires. So he carried me away right in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw the woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And then look what it says here. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. And remember, mountain is kingdom, on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings, right? So there's 7 kingdoms or mountains. Mountains is just a word that is used, a symbol in the Old Testament for kingdoms. And so each of those kingdoms has 7 kings, one for each of the kingdoms. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. So now we're getting more information about this end times beast. We got some, right, in when we had chapter 13 there, and now we're getting more in 17. They all have the 10 horns, and they all have the 7 heads. So if we look at this portion right here where it's talking about the 7 heads, it tells us that they are 7 kingdoms with 7 kings, right? 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not come. And what these are the major 7 kingdoms which have been against Israel since the beginning of time, right? And what we have are the first 5 have fallen. We have Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. No surprise. No one argues about this, because these are the major kingdoms which have come against the nation of Israel, which you guys all read about in the Old Testament, starting back with, right, Moses trying to kill all the babies. Then we had Assyria and Babylon and Medo-Persia, and then Greece also up until the time of the New Testament with Antiochus Epiphanes and that kind of thing. We'll get to that. So those are the 5 that were fallen. Remember, this is Revelation. It was given to John in the year, AD 90, approximately at that time. So it's saying that 5 have fallen, 1 is, which would be currently in control, and the other has not yet come, right? So if we go to 1 is, that's clearly Rome. No one disagrees with that. 1 is. 1 has not yet come. Now, most people today would say, well, that's got to be a revived Roman Empire. But then look what it says here in verse 11. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition. So this 8th kingdom, which is the final one, right, comes from the 7th one, and is also the 8th. So the 7th and the 8th are related. Right, so that would be an Islamic revived empire. Right, now, if we make it the classical view, you have Rome as the one that is, and then a Roman revived empire in the 7th one, and then this new world empire, which is a whole world empire in chapter 8. That's what the current teaching is, right? And if we compare the two, we have the modern traditional theory at the top, where you have Rome, Rome is the 7th, and then the New World Empire is the 8th. And remember, that has to come out of the 7th. And then at the bottom, I have this other theory, which I want you to consider, which is the Islamic theory. After Rome, the next major empire actually it was bigger and more powerful than Rome and reigned much longer, was the Islamic Caliphate empire. And it did persecute and have a lot of problems in Jews. So there's some problems right there, and that the Roman revived empire hasn't even appeared yet, really, has it? So you'd have to say that the Roman revived empire is going to appear, and then that's going to turn into a new world empire. Whereas if you go with the Islamic Caliphate, you just have to have that be revived in the end times as the eighth. So up here on the top, number 7 and 8 really haven't even occurred yet. Some people are saying, oh, well, that's what's occurring. But the problem is that this modern traditional theory doesn't fit Daniel 2 and 7. Remember, I showed you that on the map. It does not fit. Right? It doesn't match up with the geography of the prophecy. It leaves 2/3 of the nations out. Whereas the Islamic Caliphate exactly perfectly fits. It perfectly fits this portion of the prophecy. So just something to think about. And then if we look in Revelation 13, it says that the beast suffers a fatal head wound, right? Look what it says there in starting in verse 1 at the top left. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. Again, the conglomeration of what we saw in Daniel. The dragon, the devil, gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. And then it says, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast, or this empire. And remember in Revelation 17, it says, the beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel. Their names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th and is of the 7th and going to perdition. So the kingdom which is the 7th will cease to exist and then be revived, right? And that presents a problem for the Roman theory because the Roman Empire isn't even revived yet. If anything, Europe is in more a state of disarray and people exiting and having problems than it was even 10 years ago. So the final beast, whatever it is a revival of the 7th and a compilation of all the previous beasts. Right? It has to be a compilation because that's what all the prophecies, even in Revelation, say. And remember that even a revived Roman Empire just doesn't fit geographically with the revival of these beasts that are pictured in Daniel, knowing what they are. And we have the first phase, and then there's a second phase, right? We have the first beast which comes, and then there's a revival of that beast. And that beast has to be a conglomeration of all of them. So far we see in terms of our 4 pillars of the Roman end times theory that Daniel 2 doesn't work and Daniel 7 doesn't work. There's major problems there. I'm not saying they're unsurmountable, but these are major problems. They just don't seem to fit. If we look at Daniel chapter 9, this is the one that really gets people going for this Roman theory. Let's look at it, the people of the prince to come in Daniel 9. So this is the prophecy about the 70 weeks, where Daniel is given the prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. And let's just jump right in here in verse 26. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. That's the death of Jesus, and have nothing. And here it is, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until complete destruction. One is the decree is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So what we have here is the people of the Antichrist to come will destroy Jerusalem. And this is what many people convinced it's Rome, because Rome was the nation that came and destroyed Jerusalem in 770 AD. There's no denying that. But the problem is that that's not what this verse says. It says the people of the prince who is to come. And just to be clear here, this does refer to the Antichrist. It says in verse 27, he refers to the prince to come who is Antichrist, who makes the 7-year covenant. That's how we know this is talking about Antichrist. So we have the death of the Messiah in verse 26. then the destruction of Jerusalem. And those people, whoever they are, who did that, will be the ones that the Antichrist comes out of, right? Now, the problem is that the word people means an ethnic group, not a government or ruling power. It's identifying an ethnic people group, and there is a different word for a kingdom or ruling power that could have been used here, but that was not what was used. So if you read it carefully and look deeper, it's the people of the prince who is to come that will come, that the Antichrist will come from. So let's look at this. Rome, again, was the ruling nation, but were the people who did this Romans? Well, you would think they would be Romans if it's Rome, but actually they are not. If you look into history, and I'm giving you the exact references here, you can look them up on your own. Now, all we need to know from this slide is that Tacitus, who's a historian from that era, in the history 5.1, he tells us the different legions that were used to go and destroy Rome by Titus, who was the one who went in there and did this, right? He tells us it was the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 12th, the 18th, and the 3rd. Okay, so he tells us who the different legions were. All right, you can read that on your own. Pause this if you want. Now, Flavius Josephus, or Josephus, talks about the Roman destruction as well in War of the Jews, book 3, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. I have it here and the references for you. And what is important here is what's highlighted in yellow, is that Josephus says that when he came by land into Syria, where he gathered together the Roman forces, he says that he had a considerable number of auxiliaries from the kings in that neighborhood. So the army's coming in, they're building an army to go in and deal with Jerusalem, because there were Jews who were revolting and stuff at that time. And it says that they had a considerable number of auxiliaries from the kings in that neighborhood. Now, Josephus was a historian there at the time, so he's somebody who's going to know. And what's really interesting is that Josephus, in a little further down, and I have it here highlighted for you in yellow, it says, Malchus also, the king of Arabia, sent 1,000 horsemen besides 5,000 footmen, the greatest part of whom were archers, so that the whole army, including the auxiliaries sent by the kings, as well as horsemen and footmen, were all united together, amounted to 60,000. So Josephus tells us that the total army was 60,000, and that the king of Arabia contributed some men to this thing. Now, here's a table that I have. And again, putting all this data historically together, we have the 6 legions, which we know from Tacitus, the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 12th, the 3rd, and the 18th. And we know from history, looking up other sources, where those regions were stationed. They were in Judea, Syria, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, or which would be Turkey and Syria, okay? And we know how many people were in each one, right? We have 5,000 for the first 4, and the other 2 were partial. So we have about a total of 25,000 from those legions. And notice that they are almost all Arab, aren't they? Syria, Egypt, Syria, or Asia Minor, right? Now look at the next line down there. It says Josephus states that it were 60,000 total. So we know from the Roman legions that were there that was 25,000. So that leaves 35,000 volunteers or auxiliaries that Josephus mentioned. Remember, he said there were a lot of auxiliaries, of all of whom were Arabs, Syrians, and other people. So no more than 5 of the 25,000 were Romans or Westerners. And if you add all the numbers up, the next line down, 35 plus 20 equals 55,000 out of the 60,000 were of Middle Eastern descent. So the people of the prince who are to come, all of them were Middle Eastern descent. Almost all of them. The majority of the soldiers that attacked Jerusalem were provincials in the army that were Syrians, Arabs, and Eastern peoples. And it gets better. Now look what Josephus says here in his Wars book about the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember, he's a historian who was there at the time. He knows. Titus, supposing what the fact was that the house itself might yet be saved, he came in haste and endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire, and gave order to Liberius the centurion and one of those spearmen that were about him to beat the soldiers that were refractory with their staves and to restrain them. Yet their passions were too hard for the regards they had for Caesar, and the dread they had of him who forbade them, as was their hatred of the Jews and a certain vehement inclination to fight them, too hard for them also. So basically, Titus and Caesar weren't telling these guys, remember, they're almost all hired hands, right? Only 5,000 were of the Roman army proper, right? The other legions were all foreigners in there because Rome was an empire that got other people into their armies, right? These guys were trying to destroy the city and do more damage than they wanted them to. Look what it says down there at the bottom. Thus, the holy house burnt down without Caesar's approbation. What this is saying is that Rome did not authorize the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. They were telling them to stop, to quench the fire, and yet these guys, in their hatred for the Jews, right, and their vehement inclination to fight them, it says, it was too hard for them to say no, they did it anyway. So the people of the prince to come are Middle Easterners who hate the Jews from the surrounding nations, just like in every other prophecy we've read. And to make this into Rome really doesn't make any sense at all, because they weren't even Romans, the people who were the prince to come, and Rome didn't even authorize it. They were trying to get them to stop. This is a major, major blow, guys, to this theory. The Middle Eastern soldiers did it on their own, out of their own hatred for the Jews. And who hates the Jews today? Ask yourself that question. Is it Europe, or is it all those nations surrounding them? So the people of the prince to come, major problems there. And then lastly, the city on 7 hills. This is very quick. We saw this in Revelation 17. It said the 7 heads are 7 mountains or kingdoms on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. Basically, it's 7 mountains, it's not hills. And a mountain is a kingdom that each has a king. So to say that the 7 hills is Rome is really stretching it, and most people really have abandoned this. And the Greek word means mountain. It doesn't mean hill. The context is mountain and kingdom. That doesn't work either. So the 4 pillars that this theory is built on, guys, which I was taught as gospel and which I believed and never questioned, when you look at the scriptures, when you look at the history, it has some very significant problems. And this is when you're either going to go one of 2 ways. You're going to either get mad and angry and fight against it and try and find ways to defend it. Whenever you're doing that, that's a sign that something's wrong. Or you can say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's some validity to this. Maybe I need to at least consider this. I'm not going to go and say it's true, but the evidence here is overwhelming against it. Now, again, I'm not saying that this theory is the correct one, and this is the answer, and this is what everyone needs to hang their hat on. But if looking at the evidence, there certainly is strong evidence in favor of it, and it's only going to get stronger and stronger as we keep going. And so it should at least be considered as a valid theory, and that's why people like John MacArthur are actually out there teaching it, because they are convinced. So let's keep going. So a summary for the Islamic Caliphate. It fits the geography of Daniel 2, 7, and 8 perfectly. The Roman Empire does not. It perfectly matches with all of the Old Testament Day of the Lord prophecies. Europe and a revived Roman nation don't even consider this at all. It fits with the people of the prince to come perfectly. The Roman theory does not. Muslims still hate Jews today, the surrounding nations, don't they? Rome doesn't fit that. Muslims behead people. Ask yourself. In Revelation, people are being beheaded. Who's beheading people? Is it Europeans or Romans or Italians? Or is it Muslims that surround Jerusalem? Just think of ISIS, right? It all has to fit together for it to work. And unfortunately, the Roman theory seems to fail all of them. Not saying it's false, but there's problems here. Now, if we keep digging into Daniel and we start looking at the Antichrist, he is called the little horn. Remember, there were the 10 horns, and there's one horn that comes up and displaces 3. We're going to look at this because this is important. We've got to get a little closer now to the Antichrist. So remember, Daniel 2, 7, 8, 11, and 12, they all work together. Chapter 7 expands on chapter 2, and chapters 11 and 12 expand on chapter 8. And remember that chapter 8, the ram and the goat, fit with Medo-Persia and Greece. So look what it says here in chapter 7. This is talking about the little horn, which we know is Antichrist. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom the 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth speaking pompous words. Verse 19, then I wished to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet, and the 10 horns that were on its head. And the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. This is the Antichrist, this horn coming up out of the others, displacing some, speaking pompous words. No one disagrees about this. And then further down it says, the 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time, which is basically 3.5 years. Now, notice what it says, that he shall persecute the saints of the Most High and speak pompous words against the God of the Bible, against the Most High. This is what Antichrist does. Keep that in mind. And then in chapter 8, we get more information about this little horn. And what we're going to see is that, we're going to learn when we get to chapters 11 and 12 that Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn, and he is a figure in history who's going to be a type of Antichrist. So we're going to get a lot more information from Antiochus Epiphanes and his historical of what he did from chapters 8 meshing with 11 and 12. Look what it says here in Daniel 8, verse 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, this is Alexander the Great, the large horn was broken. He had a single horn, that was Alexander the Great, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And we know historically that Alexander's kingdom was broken into 4 different kingdoms, a king of the north, south, east, and west, to simplify it. And out of one of those 4 horns that came up, one of those kingdoms that replaced Alexander's, because that was his 4 generals that got these kingdoms, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did this, and all prospered. This is again is Antichrist, right? And in verse 21, it says, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. See, that tells us who it is. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. That's Alexander the Great. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And that's exactly what happened. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. So we're again talking here about the little horn who's going to be Antichrist, and we're going to see that Antiochus Epiphanes fulfills that. So it says, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, fell on my face, but he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. This is how we know that this isn't just a historical prophecy. It's talking about the very end times. These are the different kingdoms that were divided from Alexander's kingdom. We have green, yellow, orange, and then kind of pink over there. And these were the major divisions. Sorry, I had to drink some water, of Alexander's empire, and his 4 generals took over. The ones that are going to be relevant to us is going to be this green and yellow, the king of the north and the king of the south. And in Daniel 8, we have Antiochus Epiphanes is a type or foreshadowing of the Antichrist. He's the little horn. He grew up out of the Middle East, not Europe. The Antichrist will come out of the same horn, right? Because the Antichrist is going to be like Antiochus. This is very unlikely to be someone European or Roman, because he came up out of, again, Middle Eastern descent. Just another fact which fits with this theory and matches, remember, what we saw in Isaiah and Ezekiel talking about the Antichrist. And there's the maps again, which show that the Antichrist, if he comes out of the Middle East, it fits. If he doesn't, it doesn't fit from the Roman Empire. So now let's look at what Daniel 11 says about the Antichrist. Now this chapter is a continuation of chapter 10, and this is basically one big chapter. An angel is speaking here. We can't go through it. It's very long, but it's over 200 prophecies, and they're all fulfilled in detail. And basically what this does is trace from the time that Alexander lost his empire, his 4 generals took over, all of the history of these wars between the king of the north and the king of the south, all the way up to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is right around the time of the Maccabees, a little bit before the time of Jesus. So let me just show you what this says here. This is just the first 4 verses, which we'll read in this chapter 11. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up against all the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for the others. This is describing Alexander the Great and his fall and his 4 generals taking over. And when you look at Daniel 11, basically in verses 5 through 20, we have a very vivid play-by-play description, amazing prophecy, how detailed it is. Remember, it's given hundreds of years before it happened, of wars and things that happened between the Seleucid Empire of the north versus the Ptolemaic or Empire of the south. Remember that king of the north and the king of the south. It's about 150 years worth of history from 323 to 175 BC. And then in verses 21 through 35, in chapter 11, it focuses on Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He was the king of the north of the Seleucid Empire, and it covers about a 10-year history from 175 to 164 BC. And then what interestingly happens is right in verse 36, right when it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, it switches and it starts talking about Antichrist. And everyone agrees on this, guys. It's just the interpretation. So this chapter is filled with prophecy. We can't go into it all. And again, there's the 4 empires, and we're mainly focused on the green and the yellow. Antiochus is going to come out of the green, the Seleucid Empire. You can come back and look at this, but this basically shows you all the kings of the south and the north. And what's of importance, if we look at the bottom here, out of the king of the north, out of Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes IV is the one who is going to get the attention here, because he is clearly made in Scripture, even by Jesus himself, which I'll show you, a type of the Antichrist. So we need to look and see what he does. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but this is the last portion of the description of what Antiochus does, and it says that he goes through the land and causes all kinds of problems. But look what he says here in verse 28, which is highlighted at the bottom. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. We know that when he went back through Israel and Jerusalem, he really did some havoc and wreaked some havoc there, and I'll tell you about that in a minute here. And in verse 29, it keeps describing what he did. Look what it says here. At the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For Shipsam Cyphers shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he went through once and caused problems. Now he's going back to Israel and going to be angry and cause more problems, basically taking it out on them because he's having trouble with his kingdom. So it says, so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, thou shalt be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. See, it's even hinting that this is about the appointed time. Again, this is the section here which is focusing on Antiochus Epiphanes. He comes through Israel and he takes away the daily sacrifice, which we know the Antichrist will do from Revelation, and he places there the abomination of desolation. This is from Daniel 11, right? So we know, what do we know about Antiochus? Well, his ancestry, he comes from Turkey and Persia, not Europe. He invaded and conquered parts of Egypt. He made an alliance with Ptolemy, the fourth Philometor of Egypt, which is the king of the south. He was betrayed by an Egyptian alliance. He desecrated Jerusalem on his way back to Assyria after fighting Egypt, right? And he was met with a Jewish revolt. This is with the Maccabees. And he killed 80,000 people, 40,000 prisoners, 40,000 slaves. He tried to depose Antiochus' self-designated priest at the temple, who was Millennius. And then he tried to invade Egypt again, but Rome stepped in and stopped him. And in a rage, he attacked Jerusalem again. That's what we just read, that he went through Israel twice and wreaked all kinds of havoc. And that's when he slaughtered many people, stopped temple worship and the dairy sacrifice, sacrificed a pig on the altar. We know this from the time of the Maccabees. And he placed a statue of the god of Zeus in the temple, and the Jews called it the abomination of desolation. He placed an idol there, basically. That was December 15th, 167 BC. But it's important to understand, he did not stand in the temple and claim to be Yahweh. He did not do that. That's important because remember, we're getting very good specific information about what Antichrist will do from Antiochus. Instead, he mocked God, making himself to be like a god by doing these things in the temple of God. So he goes into the temple, basically mocks the true God by sacrificing, basically saying, oh yeah, if he's the real God, look at me, look what I'm going to do in his temple, portraying himself as if he is God. Not claiming that he's Yahweh, though. He didn't say, I am the God of the Jews. He didn't do that at all. He did the opposite. He mocked God and basically said he was a false God, and he was acting like God by being in that temple. Okay? That's important. Remember that. And then Judas Maccabeus was helped by Rome and led that successful revolt against him. And you can read that. The history is all in there. So in Daniel 11, we have the abomination of desolation placed there. That was written in 534 BC. It actually happened. Here's the verse from Maccabees from 167 BC. Right? Look what it says there at the beginning. And on the 5th day of Chislev in the 145th year, they set upon the altar an abomination of desolation. And in the cities of Judah on every side they established high places. And they sacrificed at the doors of the houses and in the streets. And on it goes. And then in Daniel 12, the abomination of desolation is mentioned again as part of the end times. And what's interesting is that if you look in Matthew 24 in Jesus's famous discourse on the end times, look what he says there in verse 15. It's highlighted for, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the house up not go down to take anything out of his house. Basically, Jesus saying, get out of town. So Jesus here is absolutely confirming that what Daniel wrote about and what Antiochus did are an exact shadow of what Antiochus did, that the Antichrist is going to follow that pattern to a T. And this is going to be important. right? So Jesus, 200 years later, quotes Daniel, referencing Antiochus as a type and foreshadow of what Antichrist will do in the tribulation. And that means that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, won't it? Now look what Second Thessalonians says. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or all that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And in Revelation 13:14-15, it says, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So again, speaking of the Antichrist in the temple, doing bad things, the abomination of desolation, putting an image in there, and just like Antiochus did. Now, we know again that what I told you is that in verses 36, it switches from Antiochus to talking about Antichrist. So let's read this here. This is very important. Look at verse 35. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white. That was the last verse talking about Antiochus until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time, right? And then it switches. It's giving you the hint there at the end of 35. Then the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall neither regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, and a God which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. So this is all information here that has to fit with the Antichrist and what he does. And so what does it say? First, the Antichrist rejects the God of his fathers, doesn't it? He shall neither regard the God of his fathers. In verse 37, the Antichrist rejects the desire of women. The Antichrist rejects every other god. But the Antichrist affirms and honors a God of fortresses, or a God of war. So let's look at these one by one. He shall neither regard neither the God of his fathers. So, and what that word there is, he shall not regard Elohim Ab. That is the Hebrew there. That is the God of his fathers is Elohim Ab, right? And that is always a reference to the Lord, or Yahweh, if you look in the Old Testament. So every single time you see Elohim Ab, it's referring to Yahweh, right? Now, does this mean that he will be Jewish, rejecting his childhood religion? No, because rejecting the God of the patriarchs does not equal being a Jew, does it? Because Abraham had Ishmael, and the Edomites and Esau were all from Abraham. And all major types of the Antichrist, remember, are non-Jews. Antiochus, Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrians. So none of them are Jewish people. Some people said he must be Jewish because he's rejecting the God of his fathers. But clearly, again, fitting with this idea of a Muslim or a Middle Eastern group of people that are around Jerusalem, many of these people were from Abraham, and him rejecting them would be rejecting the God of his father, Abraham. Right? So what we know here is that the Antichrist will reject the Lord Yahweh. He will reject the God of the Bible for sure, right? Now, he shall neither regard the God of his fathers nor the desire of women. Now, this is not homosexuality, guys. Some people have tried to say that. That's just not what it means. In the original context, the desire of women was always well known to be someone who was the mother of the Jewish Messiah. That was the desire of women like Mary, to be the one who brought the Messiah into the world. So that means the Antichrist will reject Jesus Christ, right? The Antichrist will reject the Father and the Son. He's rejecting the Father, he's rejecting the Son. And what does verse 1 John 2:22 says? Who is a liar, but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Even the New Testament says that the Antichrist is specifically anti-Yahweh, anti-Jesus. Right? Did John get this from Daniel 11? We don't know. And interestingly, if you go to the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is, you can see there it is, and there's this writing around the outside. I was there. I took this picture, and that writing all the way around the side of the building in Arabic. You know what it says? God is one. He has no son and is not begotten. So it is rejecting that God has a son. It's written right on the darn temple. What else do we know about him? Well, look what Psalm 2 says. Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm about the end times and the nations that the Lord will fight against. Look what it says. It says, "Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us." So what this psalm here tells us again is in the end times, nations fight against the Father and the Son. They are anti-God. They are anti-Yahweh. It's all fitting together. And if we read further about his religious views, what does it say? It says, he shall not regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, a God which his fathers did not know. That would be Abraham and them. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Right? Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. So the Antichrist does worship a god of war or military power. And he offers gifts to his God. It's a God his fathers, the patriarchs, didn't know. This is not describing an atheist simply relying on himself, because all the mentions of God would confuse the matter. That just doesn't make any sense. The Antichrist worships a specific God of war. He's not an atheist. And what prominent religion today specifically rejects the Father and the Son of the Bible and is known for a God of war or jihad? Is it not Muslims? It is. Now, will he claim to be God? Will the Antichrist claim to be God? We'll look at Daniel 11:36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, right? And in Revelation 13:6, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. So realize that a Muslim leader would not claim ever to be Allah, nor would any Muslims follow such a man who did. Right? If some Muslim guy says, I am Allah, no one's going to believe him. That's not even part of their end times prophecy or anything else. No one would believe him, and he would never utter that. And the Antichrist also worships a god of war, right? We've seen that. And would he claim to be God while worshiping another god? Well, he would not. And we know that he's specifically speaking against Yahweh here. He clearly blasphemes the Lord Yahweh and is not claiming to be him. So he can't be claiming to be Yahweh, because it says here that he's blaspheming against him, right? Now, back to that 2 Thessalonians verse, right? What does it say? That let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin, the Antichrist, is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, people quickly read through this and say, well, see, there it is. He's claiming to be God. It says so. But realize and understand, this is what's used to teach that Antichrist claims to be God. What we just seen in the last slide, it can't mean that he's claiming to be the Lord or Yahweh, because he's blaspheming against him. So he does not go into the temple and say, I am Yahweh, I am the God of the Bible. He does not do that. It could mean he's just simply acting in defiance of the Lord by sitting in his temple where he is supposed to dwell, just like Antiochus did. Remember, we said that Antiochus did not claim to be God. He just went in and made a mockery in the temple, kind of acting like he was God by defying the true and living God whose temple he was in, right? The temple, remember, is God's seat on earth. That's his seat on earth. And the Antichrist could just be declaring himself to be equal or greater in power to the Lord of the Jews without claiming to be Allah or claiming to actually be some kind of God. It could be more of a demonstrative thing. Showing himself can mean that he is demonstrating that the God of the Jews is a false God because he is sitting in his temple. That's all simply that it could mean. That's very possible. Look what Revelation 13:4-8 says. So they worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him? All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Right? So you have all these people worshiping him. Doesn't that mean that he's God? Doesn't worship mean he is claiming to be God or thought of as a God? No, it does not. The Greek word for worship simply means to bow down. And it can easily mean that people are giving full submission to the authority of this man, right? And Muslims must make a verbal pledge of total allegiance to any sitting caliph, and refusal is punishable by death. And we know that millions bow down towards Allah every day. They bow down, and that would easily fit with this Greek word, therefore worship. It does not mean that the Antichrist is God. It just means that they are bow down and bowing to him in authority. So just the Antichrist's religious summary. A proper belief about him is that the Antichrist will verbally declare himself to be God and demand worship from the entire world. But we've just seen that doesn't seem to make any sense. He can't be an atheistic humanism type person, right? That's someone who rejects all gods, mocking God, yet claiming to be a God himself as an atheist. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because it doesn't fit. He also can't be a religious pluralist or universalist. This type of person would accept all religions and not demand allegiance or death. The prophecies clearly show the end times and the Antichrist will be centered in the Middle East, and all of which are Muslim. And think about this. How could a leader of another religion or atheist unite 1.6 billion Muslims, even all the radicals in the Middle East? These guys are very loyal. They are not going to get behind anybody. And those are the nations which come against Israel. You have to explain that. Whatever happens, you must have these Middle Eastern people on board, since the Bible makes it clear from all the prophecies we saw of the Lord fighting the end times nations. Those are the nations that he fights. That means they're on board with Antichrist. If you have a European person or an atheist or a religious pluralist person, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit. But if he is a leader of a new Islamic caliphate, they would bow down to him. You would have them on board. They would be coming against Jerusalem to try and destroy them, just like they've always wanted to do, just like some of their leaders in Iran and Iraq have preached for years that they want to do. All that fits very nicely, doesn't it? And one other thing, the dominion of the Antichrist. Is it really universal or is it limited? This verse has been what's led people to believe that it will be this one world religion and this thing that encompasses the entire world. But I don't know that that's the case. And let me show you why. Revelation 13. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life, slain from the foundation of the world. Now, that's pretty strong language, isn't it? That means that it has to be this one world religion, and he has to rule over the entire world, doesn't it? I mean, that's what it says. Every tribe, tongue, and nation, all who dwell on the earth will worship him. Isn't that pretty clear? But remember, look what the wording was in Daniel given to Nebuchadnezzar. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown to the reaches of heaven, and your dominion to the end of the earth. Now, did Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom reach to the end of the earth? No, not even close. It didn't touch any of the other continents. It was only in that region there, which I've shown you on the maps. It wasn't even close to the whole earth. Or look in Daniel 5. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory, and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Now, was it all peoples, nations, and languages, that same exact wording that's used in Revelation? No, it was not. It was talking about all peoples, nations, and languages on the biblical-centric world centered around Jerusalem, which is the timepiece for God and what he is doing in the world. And so isn't it interesting that the same language used in Daniel to describe Babylon and its kingdom and its influence is exactly the same as what's described in Revelation. You see, we don't have a Middle Eastern mindset. We have a Western mindset. I think, well, it has to include us. It has to have something to do with us, but it does not necessarily have to be that way. This could very easily and very seems to be hyperbole here. We know it is in Daniel because Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom wasn't even close. And many people all over will worship, but not every last person on the planet. That doesn't make any sense that that would happen. Right? Now think about this. If Islam is the religion of Antichrist, then he would have converts in every nation on earth, even if he didn't control every one of those nations, right? All Muslims throughout the globe would easily be converted to follow him. There's Muslims everywhere. In fact, that's one of their plans now is they're infiltrating all parts of the world, especially Europe, and they're working on it in the United States. And so it would make sense that he would have a world control, but it wouldn't be every single person and nation, just like Nebuchadnezzar did. Look at Daniel 7. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. Well, we know that that's simply not the case, because that's not what happened. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. That third kingdom did not rule over all the earth, the kingdom of Greece. It was just that it ruled that whole region, which was biblicocentric to Israel, all those nations since the beginning of time that surrounded Israel that always wanted to destroy them. That's what it meant, the whole earth there in that case. And the Aramaic there is kol ara, and it means the entire area of the Near and Middle East related to the Holy Land, but it does not mean the entire globe. Alexander the Great did not rule the entire world. And language like this is even used in Luke. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Well, it wasn't all the world. It wasn't China. It wasn't people living in South America. It was just everyone in the empire that was in question there. Right? And if we look in Daniel 11 here, this is talking about Antichrist. Look what it says in his wars. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But look at this, verse 44. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So here in Daniel 11, absolutely, positively talking about the Antichrist and his battles, it shows you that he doesn't have some world domination. He's got problems. He's got people escaping from him. He gets news from the east and the north that troubles him, and he goes out with a fury to destroy him. So he doesn't have world dominating power. He has opposition to his rule, and he does not rule over the entire world. And in Daniel 12, the final prophecy, and then we're done for tonight. Daniel 12 says, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, at the time your people shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So the Hebrew word here means to search for something. So basically it's saying many people will scrutinize the book and knowledge shall increase, which means that the prophecy will be revealed in the last days. And the Roman theory, just so you know, goes all the way back to the 3rd century. But if that's the case, then how could it be sealed to the time of the end? Even that little minor point just doesn't seem to fit. So we are done. What we're going to start in with next time is some Muslim theology. And what I'm going to show you is that if you look at what the Muslim theology is for the end times, it exactly matches what the Bible's is, except it's the exact opposite. And you're going to have to ask yourself, what are the chances of their end times theology exactly matching ours, but being the exact opposite? This is going to be just another piece of the puzzle. Then we're also going to look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, that war. And finally, we're going to look at who Revelation, the great harlot, is in Revelation 18 and 19, 17, 18, and 19, who that great mystery Babylon the Great. So a lot of information, a lot for you guys to think about. I want you to go back and do your own thinking on this, your own homework on this. Again, I'm not saying that this is right or this is the answer, but clearly, if you look at it, it is very strong and really fits perfectly. There aren't many problems with this theory. There are some, but there aren't many, and it's certainly worth considering. Thank you, and have a blessed night. See you next week.